June 1945. A requisitioned office in London belonging to the British War Crimes Investigation Unit holds a stack of index cards, one for each of the 118 agents of the Special Operations Executive's French section who parachuted into occupied France and never reported back. And a woman in Women's Auxiliary Air Force uniform is going through them one by one, cross-referencing names against radio logs, arrest records, and the increasingly fragmentary testimony beginning to leak out of a defeated Germany. She has just secured permission she was not required to get and took anyway. Permission to go and find out, personally, what happened to every single one of them. She is 37 years old. For the past 4 years, she has recruited these people, trained them, checked what they were wearing before they left, invented and rehearsed their cover stories with them, and in many cases escorted them to the airfield in the dark to watch them board the Lysanders and Halifaxes that flew them into France. More than 400 agents went into occupied France through her section. At least 100 of them came back marked missing, presumed dead. 12 of the missing were women, and they were, by every account of people who worked alongside her, the agents she was most protective of. She intends to find every one of them, or what remains of them, and she is Jewish. And she is about to spend the next year and a half walking into the ruins of the concentration camp system. Her name was Vera Atkins. And she was born Vera Maria Rosenberg on the 15th of June 1908 in either Galassi or Bucharest, Romania. The sources differ on the exact city, though they agree on the year and the country, to a German Jewish businessman named Max Rosenberg, and a mother from an Eastern European Jewish family that had emigrated by way of South Africa. The Rosenberg family's fortune, built on timber, collapsed in the early 1930s. Her father died in 1933, and as anti-Semitic pressure hardened across Romania through that decade, she made the calculation her family's circumstances demanded and relocated permanently to Britain in 1937, adopting her mother's English surname, Atkins, as her own, a choice that would later make it considerably harder for anyone meeting her for the first time to guess where she had actually come from, or what she had actually been born. She was fluent in French, English, German, and Romanian, moved in cosmopolitan circles in pre-war Bucharest and London, and before the war even reached her adopted country she had already, quietly, done something she would keep secret for the rest of her life. In the spring of 1940, before she had any formal role in British intelligence, she traveled to the Low Countries and arranged a bribe to an Abwehr officer named Hans Philly to secure a passport and safe passage for her cousin, Fritz Rosenberg. Out of Nazi-controlled territory, it worked. She told almost no one. Her biographer, the journalist Sarah Helm, only learned the full story decades later by asking mourners at Atkins's funeral about her early life. Because Atkins herself had spent 60 years making sure the people closest to her knew almost nothing about where she came from or what she had done before 1941. She joined the Special Operations Executive's French section, known internally as F Section, in February 1941, initially as a secretary, and rose within months to become the de facto intelligence officer and closest working partner of the section's chief, Colonel Maurice Buckmaster. This was despite the fact that she was, at the time, not even a British citizen. Her Romanian birth technically classified her as an enemy alien, a legal status that made her position inside one of Britain's most sensitive intelligence organizations genuinely unusual, and, to some of her colleagues, faintly suspicious for years afterward. She was formally naturalized as a British subject in February 1944 and commissioned as a flight officer in the WAAF that August, meaning she spent more than 3 years doing intelligence work for a country that had not yet, on paper, accepted her as one of its own citizens. Inside F Section, Atkins's job was recruitment, training oversight, and, most distinctively, the personal preparation of agents before deployment, work she carried out with an attention to detail that former colleagues and later historians both single out. She reportedly selected each agent's clothing personally, insisting on era-appropriate French tailoring with authentic French labels, matched agents with regionally correct French cigarette brands so a stray pack in a pocket wouldn't betray them, and helped construct the small convincing props of an ordinary life undercover. Diaries, photographs, ration books, that were meant to hold up under a Gestapo search. She was, by her own later account, and by the accounts of the women she sent into France, especially attentive to the female agents, several of whom she described as favorites. Noor Inayat Khan and Violette Sabo, the latter the mother of a small child, are the two names that come up most often in the recollections of people who worked alongside her at SOE's Baker Street offices and at the departure airfields. A former MI5 filing clerk later told Sarah Helm something that has won the historical record precisely because of how plainly it states the horror underneath the routine. The agents were all told, clearly, that this was life and death work, and, in the clerk's words as recorded by Helm, it didn't seem to bother them. It is worth being honest here about what F section actually was and what happened to a significant fraction of the people who went through it, because Atkins's post-war search cannot be understood apart from the operational disaster that produced so many names on her list in the first place. The largest single SOE network in France was known as Prosper, run by a half-English, half-French barrister named Francis Sutil under the field name Prosper. Through 1943, evidence accumulated that Prosper had been penetrated by German intelligence, most damningly when a radio operator inside the network, Gilbert Norman, code-named Archambaud, began transmitting messages to London that omitted his true security check, the deliberate coded tell every operator built into their transmissions specifically to signal, silently, that they were operating under duress. A missed security check was meant to be an alarm. It was missed, or not acted on, more than once. Buckmaster, by the account of multiple historians including Helm, continued sending additional agents into the Prosper network, even after intelligence staff heard a German-accented voice apparently impersonating one of the captured operators over a compromised radio link. The network collapsed through the summer of 1943 in a wave of arrests. More than 50 people taken by the Gestapo in a matter of weeks, and 10 of the 13 female F section agents who died during the war were connected, directly or indirectly, to the fallout of that collapse. Atkins, as Buckmaster's closest deputy, has been the subject of decades of historical argument over how much she knew, when she knew it, and why the section did not pull agents out once the signs of penetration were visible. Sarah Helm's biography does not accuse Atkins of active betrayal, but does describe her, in Helm's assessment, as slavishly deferential to Buckmaster's authority at moments when a more forceful challenge might have saved lives. A judgment other historians, including the SOE's official historian MRD Foote, have pushed back against, arguing that F Section's overall contribution to Allied operations, including support for the Normandy landings, outweighed the cost even accounting for these catastrophic losses. Among the women caught in the wider net of arrests that followed the Prosper collapse and the broader rolling German counter-penetration of SOE circuits through 1943 and into 1944 were 8 agents who ended up, by a coincidence of timing that later became one of the most cited details in their story, imprisoned together at Fresnes prison outside Paris and then moved as a single group. On the 13th of May 1944, André Borel, Sonia Olszczynski, Diana Rowden, Vera Lee, Yolande Beekman, Madeleine Damerment, Eliane Plumen, and Odette Sansom were transferred together from Fresnes to Gestapo headquarters at 84 Avenue Foch in Paris, and from there put on a train to Karlsruhe prison in Germany, each woman handcuffed to a German guard. Odette Sansom later gave an interview in which she described the mood on that journey. The group starting out together in fear, she said. All of them hoping above everything that they would somehow stay together, none of them expecting much beyond that, and all of them aware that execution was a real possibility, though she alone among them had actually been formally sentenced to death at that point. Sansom would turn out to be the only one of the 8 to survive the war.
André Borel, codenamed Monique, was 24 and had been the first female SOE agent parachuted into occupied France working as an explosive specialist inside the Prosper network in Paris. Diana Rowden, codenamed Paulette, Chaplin, and Marcel, was British by birth but had grown up largely in France. She had volunteered as a Red Cross nurse before becoming a section officer in the WAAF and entering France with the Acrobat network, and was posthumously awarded the Croix de Guerre and mentioned in dispatches. Vera Lee had been captured in October 1943. Sonia Olshanesky was 20 years old, a German-born Jewish refugee, the daughter of the same Nazi persecution that had driven Atkins's own family out of Central Europe, who had fled to Paris, was briefly interned at the Drancy deportation camp in 1940, and later joined the Juggler network as a courier, eventually taking over the running of the circuit itself after its organizer was captured and his deputy fled to Switzerland. Because Olshanesky was French resistance rather than formally an SOE commissioned officer, her name was not initially on Atkins's list of missing agents at all, and establishing what had happened to her took additional separate work. On the 6th of July, 1944, not quite 2 months after their arrival, in Karlsruhe, Borel, Lee, Rowden, and Olshanesky were taken from the prison, given back their personal possessions in some formality that made the moment feel almost administrative, and handed to 2 Gestapo escorts who drove them roughly 800 kilometers southwest to the Natzweiler-Struthof concentration camp in the Vosges mountains of Alsace, arriving in the mid-afternoon. Their arrival was apparently unplanned by the camp's ordinary routine. Women were rare at Natzweiler, and their presence immediately drew attention from both guards and prisoners, and one of their Gestapo escorts gave an order that the 4 were to be executed that same day. They were held through the evening in a cell block at the base of the camp. In the early hours of the following morning, they were taken one at a time into a small room, told they were receiving a typhus inoculation, and injected instead with a lethal dose of phenol by a camp medical orderly. Their bodies were placed directly into the crematorium furnace. According to the testimony of a fellow prisoner, at least one of the women was still alive when she was put into the furnace and visibly struggled. The killings were meant to disappear entirely under the Nazi night and fog, Nacht und Nebel protocol, which was designed to make prisoners vanish without any trace or record their families could ever trace. They did not entirely vanish because 2 prisoners at Natzweiler that week, a captured SOE agent named Brian Stonehouse and a Belgian resistance member named Albert Garis, both witnessed the women's arrival and survived the war to say so. 4 more of the group executed elsewhere the same year were Yolande Beekman, Madeleine Damerment, Eliane Pluman, and the name now most widely remembered of any SOE agent, largely because of a later award and a later biography, Noor Inayat Khan. Khan, born in Moscow in 1914 to an Indian Sufi mystic father and an American mother, and raised largely in France, had become the first female wireless operator sent by SOE into occupied France, working under the codename Madeleine. She was betrayed and arrested in October 1943, attempted to escape twice, once climbing across rooftops during an air raid alongside 2 other agents before being recaptured, and was held for months at Karlsruhe, refusing throughout to give her interrogators anything of value. Beekman, codenamed Mariette or Yvonne, had married only months before deploying to France as a wireless operator with the Musician Network, and was remembered, in the words used in a wartime account, for her cheerfulness and courage. Pluman, codenamed Gaby, was born in France but had grown up partly in Leicester and fluent Spanish and Portuguese. She had parachuted in July 1943 with the Monk Network and was arrested in April 1944. Damerment had been captured almost immediately after landing in France as part of a German orchestrated deception operation that used a captured radio to lure in further agents. In September 1944, Kahn, Beekman, Pluman, and Damerment were moved together from Karlsruhe to Dachau concentration camp in Bavaria. In the early hours of the 13th of September, 1944, the 4 women were led into a yard, told to kneel, and shot in the back of the head by SS men, their bodies burned immediately afterward in the camp crematorium. An unverified account that surfaced years later from an anonymous former Dutch prisoner claimed that Kahn in particular was singled out for a severe beating by an SS officer before being shot, and that her final word was liberté, a detail repeated in many popular accounts of her death, but one that historians note rests on a single uncorroborated post-war source and should be treated with appropriate caution rather than as settled fact. What is far better documented is the confusion that followed the war over exactly where and how these 4 women died. 9 Natzweiler camp staff members were tried and convicted by a British military court specifically for the murder of Noor Inayat Khan, a conviction based on testimony that placed her death at Natzweiler rather than Dachau. It was not until 1947, after extensive further investigation, that Atkins herself concluded that Kahn and Beekman had in fact been executed at Dachau, correcting the earlier record. The confusion arose in large part because the fourth Natzweiler victim, Sonia Olshansky, was for a period misidentified as Nur-in-Ayat Khan, before Atkins's own detective work established the correct names, meaning it was literally Atkins's individual casework, cross-referencing physical descriptions, clothing, timing, and camp records, that untangled which women died where. That casework is the center of the story, and it looked none like a single dramatic confrontation. When Germany surrendered, Atkins secured her own attachment to the British War Crimes Investigation Unit, rather than accept the War Office's initial reluctance to prioritize the search for missing F-Section personnel, and beginning in September 1945, she spent close to 18 months, mostly without full official backing until 1946, physically traveling through occupied Germany to interrogate the people who had run the camp and prison system her agents disappeared. She questioned Anton Kindl, commandant of Sachsenhausen, and Fritz Suren, commandant of Ravensbrück, directly. In one specifically documented exchange, she confronted an SS officer named Johann Schwarzhuber with photographs of the missing women, until he was able to identify which of them had passed through his custody at Ravensbrück. She also personally interviewed Hans Kiefer, the head of German counterintelligence in Paris, shortly before his execution, an interview whose full content Sarah Helm's research suggests Atkins never fully disclosed, including apparent information about the extent to which Prosper's own leader, Francis Suttle, may have cooperated with his captors in an attempt to save agents' lives, a possibility that, if true, would have reframed part of the network's collapse, and that some historians believe Atkins chose to keep from the historical record for reasons she never explained. Her investigative work became the evidentiary foundation for the subsequent British war crimes. Prosecutions connected to these deaths, most directly the trial that came to be known as the trial of Werner Rode and 8 others, held before a British military court concerning the murders of André Borel, Sonia Olshansky, Vera Lee, and Diana Rowden at Natzweiler, and separately the first Ravensbrück war crimes trials, which drew heavily on the detailed depositions Atkins had personally taken from camp guards and commandants, describing what happened to the women who passed through that camp. Her documentation, according to later accounts of her work, ensured that the women who had served under her were recorded in the post-war reckoning, not as civilians who happened to die in wartime captivity, but as soldiers killed in action, a distinction that mattered enormously for how their deaths were classified, honored, and compensated, and one that might not have been established with the same clarity without Atkins's specific, dogged insistence on tracing every individual case to its documented end. By the close of her search, she had traced the fate of 117 of the 118 missing F-Section agents and had personally accounted for all 14 of the missing women. None of this made Atkins a straightforwardly beloved or uncomplicated figure, and the honest record includes the parts of her that don't fit a clean hero narrative. Sarah Helm's biography, drawing on interviews with people who had known her, describes many of Atkins's own contemporaries as regarding her as a sinister, unlikable, and deeply guarded person, someone whose instinct in a crisis was control and concealment rather than openness. A pattern Helm connects back to the secrecy Atkins had already practiced years earlier over her cousin's 1940 rescue and her own precarious legal status as an enemy alien inside British intelligence. Helm documents specific instances where this reticence had real consequences. Atkins's refusal to testify at the post-war treason trial of Henri Dericourt, an SOE air movement officer widely suspected of working simultaneously for German intelligence, a trial at which her testimony might well have changed the outcome, and where Dericourt was ultimately acquitted. Her incomplete disclosure of what Kiefer had told her about Suttle's possible cooperation with the Gestapo, and a general lack of candor, noted by several of the missing agents' surviving relatives, in what she was willing to tell grieving families about how their loved ones actually died. Some former colleagues and Later, some writers went further still, floating theories over the years that Atkins herself might have been a Soviet or even a German intelligence asset, claims that Helms' research does not support, and that most historians treat as unfounded, but which circulated for decades partly, as some reviewers of Helms' book have pointedly observed, because Atkins was a private, hard-to-read woman operating in a field where her male counterparts' emotional openness protected them. It's the same suspicion that attached itself to her guardedness. What is not in dispute is the scale and seriousness of what she actually did between 1945 and 1946. 18 months of face-to-face interrogation of the men who ran Sachsenhausen, Ravensbrück, and the wider camp apparatus her own family had narrowly escaped a decade earlier by leaving Romania in time. The correction of the historical record on where and how Nur Inayat Khan and Yolande Beekman actually died. The identification of Sonia Olshanesky, a fellow refugee from Nazi persecution killed alongside 3 British agents, whose name might otherwise have been permanently absorbed into someone else's, and the documentary foundation for 2 of the major post-war British war crimes trials connected to SOE's losses in France. She was appointed CBE for this work. She went on after the war to advise the makers of 2 films based on the lives of the agents she had known, Odette, based on Odette Sansom's story, and Carve Her Name with Pride, based on Violette Szabo's, and assisted the writer Jean Overton Fuller with a biography of Nur Inayat Khan, though Overton Fuller herself later came to suspect, wrongly according to Helm, that Atkins had been a Soviet agent. Atkins never married, spent much of the rest of her life declining to discuss the details of the search in any depth, and died on the 24th of June 2000 in Hastings, at the age of 92, a woman whose own family, by her biographer's account, learned more truth about her early life at her funeral than they had in the whole of the previous 6 decades. She has also been cited, though never confirmed, as a possible partial inspiration for Miss Moni Penny in Ian Fleming's James Bond novels, a rumor that says something about how she was perceived by people who worked around SOE's secretive, all-male command structure without ever quite being let all the way in. What makes Atkins's actual story different from the popular image of a single decisive interrogation is that there was no one dramatic question, and no single prisoner who broke and told her everything. It was 18 months of granular, unglamorous casework, camp records cross-checked against physical descriptions, contradictory guard testimony picked apart one inconsistency at a time, photographs held up in front of men who had every reason to lie and who one by one ran out of room to keep lying. It was also, by the honest account of her own biographer, casework carried out by a woman who kept things from the people who trusted her, who protected her own secrets as fiercely as she pursued the truth about everyone else's, and whose full motives, how much duty to her missing agents, how much personal reckoning with a catastrophe that had swallowed people she knew from a Europe she had only barely escaped herself, she never fully explained to anyone, including, it seems, herself. If a woman spending a year and a half walking into the wreckage of the camp system to trace 14 missing names, while carrying her own contradictions the entire time, sounds like a story more people should know in its full and complicated form, say so in the comments, and subscribe, because this is exactly the kind of record that gets to flatten into something simpler than it actually was.